How do you read a judgment? Reading judgments properly is a key asset that law students have if they want to make good research. You need to be able to read judgments not just in order to prepare for your exams, but also in order to write a BA thesis or an MA thesis, and even in your PhD, reading judgments is one of the most essential tools that you have. Now, when you're reading a judgment, there's a very big difference if you are just using a judgment or two from a foreign system for comparative law, or if it's a system that you know very well. When I studied law, I studied mostly judgments of the Israeli Supreme Court. Most of the syllabuses had hundreds of these judgments, and we just had to read them, and I did that. Afterwards, when I served in a military law school, one of my tasks was to read every single judgment and decision issued by the Israeli Supreme Court this week. 150 decisions per week I used to read. On them, I basically read all the corpus of the decisions of the court. And this gave me a very good insight into how the courts work. That's a court that you know very, very well. What I'm going to do now is give a series of tips that are relevant even if you don't know the system perfectly. So even if you're forced to read one judgment from United Kingdom, one judgment from New Zealand, and you need to do it for your research, this also applies obviously if you know the judgments well. It's just going to make it easier for you. My name is Shai Lotan. I'm Associate Professor of International Public Law at the University of Copenhagen Faculty of Law, and the purpose of this series of lectures is to help you improve your research and your English. The first decision that you have to make when you're getting yourself ready to read a judgment for your research is if this judgment is what I call a ninja judgment or it's a regular judgment. What are ninja judgments? Ninja judgments are judgments that are the core of your analysis. I've supervised dozens of research work by students, and I see that many times in a good thesis, you have between 2 and 5 judgments that are absolutely crucial for the analysis. So they are the center of an analysis that explains strategically how the courts behave, that reviews important changes in the doctrine, that throws light on research that was done on the court. All these things make these judgments absolutely core of the analysis. They're not just a way to review the law on a particular point as a kind of a more specific position than a statute. They're actually a whole world of judicial development and potentially also judicial strategy that is relevant for the analysis. And these are your ninja judgments. Now, if you are decided that this judgment is one of these 2 to 5 judgments that are key to your analysis, you need to read them very, very differently. The key to reading them is you want to try to squeeze out all the possible ideas that can come from these judgments. Everything that can support your research, that can improve your analysis, that can give you new insights. And how do you do that? So what I usually do is, if I have a ninja judgment, I did it even in my PhD, when I had plenty of other things to do, I would clear out the day. So I'm now going to sit and read the judgment, especially if this judgment is from a system that I don't know that well, and I need to acquaint myself also with the rules of a system, because every system has a very different judgment. The judgment of the European Court of Human Rights is very different from the judgment of an American Supreme Court. So I print out the judgment, and then I would sit down with a marker and pens, and I would start to mark on the judgments all the different insights that I can find from there. I would read, not focusing only on the main ratio decidentis, so the main argument of the court, but also all the arguments that the judges are saying in obiter, and anything else from that matter. I would read the dissents. I would read the concurring opinions. Even though they don't matter for the result, they are very, very important, because here you have somebody that is very intelligent, very knowledgeable, read all the material in the case, has a different opinion. You need to understand that if this is a ninja judgment. So that really should be your focus. And you try to, at the same time that I'm marking and markering on this page, have a Word file in which I continuously accumulate more and more ideas, and I learn everything that I can from this judgment. Only after I've done that. So the first cut is always me. I try to see the judgment with fresh eyes. I try to understand how much I can understand from this judgment. After I've done all that, I would, especially if it's an important judgment, go to the web and start to see what people wrote about it. So if it's a judgment by a major court on a major issue, you could find dozens of blog posts, or if it's a later judgment, even case reviews in important journals. And I would read those and try to see if I agree with them, if they are similar to what I noted, and if not, what is the issue? Why am I so different from these views of these others? And usually I would get some more ideas there. And then I would try to organize all these ideas in a nice Word file when I do a full summary of the judgment, not in the order of the facts that are there, so not necessarily the facts, the doctrine, etc., but all the ideas that are relevant from this judgment that can help my research. And I used to tell my students, you remember that you have to squeeze every single drop that you can out of a judgment. And I once had a student to ask me, so how much should you squeeze? And I said, well, when you squeeze a lemon, you squeeze it until all the lemon juice comes out. When you squeeze and cucumber juice comes out, then you can stop. So you try to get all the ideas that you can that are relevant for this judgment until you get all of them. And that's exactly the key that you do, what you do with a ninja judgment. And then afterwards you weave it into your analysis. Sometimes it would even be a whole subchapter that would review judgment. Sometimes it would be divided between some parts in your thesis. But always, if it's a ninja judgment, it will take quite a few good paragraphs to use the data, the ideas that you got from this judgment. So that's how you read a ninja judgment. Now, how to read a regular judgment, not a ninja judgment. So this is especially relevant if there's a system that you know well. When you're a student, usually it's your national system. So if you live in Denmark, it's a Danish court. If you live in the United States, it's an American Supreme Court. And then you want to get the main idea from the judgment so that you can support your arguments in your thesis. Now, when I write research, almost every sentence is supported by a footnote that refers to scholarship that says something similar or connected to what I'm saying. When I was writing as a student, most of my references were to judgments. So I used to make a statement and then the footnote would refer to doctrine that says something similar in a certain judgment of the Israeli Supreme Court, almost always. And that's something that you still need to do a lot as a student. And of course, if you continue this habit, this will build your ability to understand doctrine well, because that's what you're doing, basically. You're making arguments and you're trying to support them by precedents. And most systems have some form of what is called stare decisis, which means that the decisions of previous courts still have legal force later on. We are bound by them, maybe not completely, maybe we can change them a little bit, but there's almost always some precedential value. Even in systems that deliberately state that there's no precedential value, judges usually try to respect the judgment that they issued before. So just like a judgment that you read references previous judgments, you need to do that a lot in your research. But here you have to remember that you're not dealing with a ninja judgment that is the core of your analysis. What you need to do is be very, very efficient in how you extract the main legal points of a judgment. So one way to try to do that is to read a summary or a ratio, as it's called, of a judgment that was prepared by others. I prefer not to take this route. I think that the best route is to try to learn the main arguments of the judgments by yourself and to just get efficient at reading judgment, because this is one of your core skills. So what you want to do now is, if you have a lot of judgments that are peripheral to an argument, or that you need to support a certain small doctrinal point somewhere in your thesis, so what I want you to do is I want you to read these judgments relatively fast, and I want you to try to think about how you extract from them one major idea, which is a ratio, the main decision that the judgment does that contributes to a precedential value and changes the doctrine on this issue. You need to be very adept at doing that. When you're reading a judgment that is not a ninja judgment, you don't focus on the obiter, which is sometimes a very significant part of a judgment, a very long, much longer part. You don't care so much about dissents and concurring opinions. You just want to say, what is the precedential value of a judgment? If I were to go to court today in this system, how will this judgment change the result? So if you want to be a good lawyer, you need to, especially in a common law system where judgments are much more important, you need to get into the habit of reading judgments quickly, extracting the ratio, and then knowing how to weave them into your analysis. And again, it depends on what your analysis is doing. Many excellent theses that I supervise cited, just like I do today most of the time, a lot of scholarship, not so much judgments, but I also supervise thesis, and I'm always looking forward the ability to supervise a thesis that refers to actual judgments and deals with the law. So a paragraph would have 3 long sentences or 5 long sentences, and almost every sentence would be a footnote referring to a judgment stating this result. Knowing what is the law, what is the precedential decision on this particular issue. So remember, you want to read these judgments fast, you want to extract a ratio of a judgment, and you want to learn how to weave it into your analysis. So in the relevant statement that you say, this is the doctrine in Israel at this point, you would put a footnote and you would refer to the relevant judgment. That's what you do with a regular judgment. There is also a third way to think about judgments. So not a ninja judgment that you use for your entire analysis of the strategy of the court, of the history of the court, of a critical view of the court, and not a regular judgment when you just extract a ratio and try to understand what is the law, but rather a basis for quantitative research. Which means that what you're doing is basically counting. You're trying to understand how the court works. You're making an empirical analysis of that, a quantitative analysis of that, and you are using the judgments for that. Now, I've written a paper in English and in Danish about quantitative research. I don't want to discuss it now. What I want to do is I want to try to explain to you how do you read a judgment for quantitative research. Now, what you want to do is you would have a reservoir of ideally something between 50 and 150 judgments, which is something that is manageable to read carefully, but also not too small so that you get good results. And what you want to do now is actually code the judgment. So read it through and make a decision. Now, the important part of coding is that it forces you to make difficult choices. Many of the research that you find in law, and I'm also guilty in that, I think in part of my research, tries to analyze judgments by using relatively vague words. So we claim that the judgment is activist, or a judgment is conservative, or a judgment is liberal. All these words are very easily subject to manipulation. So you can read the judgment and make a whole argument why it is very activist, and you can read the judgment separately and make a whole argument why it's not an activist judgment at all, it's a very conservative judgment. Now, what coding forces you to do is to decide, how do you determine if a judgment is activist? And that's a great part of its benefit for scholars. And if you are a young scholar, you can rest assured that this is something that, for example, your supervisor and later on people that can hire you for a job are going to view very highly, because they're going to say, first, you make clear cuts and they say, this is what I'm going to look at, and I'm very, very precise about what I'm doing. Second, you put in the work, doing this coding, first of all setting the metrics, deciding on them, and of course then actually reading the judgments carefully is something that is very time consuming and it's very difficult, and that's going to make a great impression. And of course, the most important thing is we hope that you contribute to science, because you actually are able to say something that changes our understanding of the law. Now, again, without going into all this analysis of quantitative research, which I might do in a later video, I just want to remind you here what you're doing. You need to be very efficient, you need to be very precise. You set the coding metric and you work through it. So you will have to read a lot of judgments, and you can't allow yourself to daydream about all kinds of interesting ideas there, because what you need to do is make a decision, and the decision needs to be 100% precise and non-negotiable. this is a judgment that is activist. And if the word activist is too broad, then you find some other word, and you find some other way to do the coding. Now, later on in your career, when you have a whole team of students sometimes working for you, there are all kinds of ways to get around this problem. So you would have many students coding the same judgment, and you kind of compare the coding and you see if it's consistent, and if it's very consistent, then that's a good tip. As a student, you don't have this luxury, which means that you need to decide very, very accurately what it is you're looking for, and you need to read these judgments looking for this result, looking for the ultimate decision. How do I code this judgment? In one way or in another way? So these were 3 different ways to read judgments. Either there's a ninja judgment, that you take everything out of it, squeeze every single idea that you can, or as a judgment as a source for doctrine that you use to make a very simple doctrinal point, looking for veracity dissidency in one judgment after the other. And the third way, how do you read a judgment for a quantitative research? It's a different mechanism, very, very different way to think about it, and requires a different set of readings.